how do we really have conversations with people in business? And how do we really get business on side while not seen to be kind of attacking? Because I often feel as soon as someone takes a more negative stance, then they lose an opportunity for conversation with people inside large organizations. And I think one of the parts that I've very much used in our business consultancy, which people inside businesses really respond to, is this phrase, meaningful disturbances. I love the way in the systems view of life you write about meaningful disturbances. And when we talk about engaging organizations on Capra course, it's really interesting because the way Capra course is structured, we go through a lot of the theory first, and then in the second half we really start to look at practical solutions in various fields. So Fritjof, where does this phrase meaningful disturbances come from? Because for me it really resonates with a lot of people in business, because there are people in business who can see that they really do need to contribute to a change in thinking and a reframing of, you know, their core businesses.
Yeah, this is surprising to me and very encouraging that people respond to this term strongly. It comes from a theory in contemporary cognitive science that is very radical. It's known as the Santiago theory of cognition, and it says that a living system responds to disturbances with structural changes. It changes its structure, like brain structure or physical structure or cellular structure at the level of cells, and it does so by choosing which disturbances to respond to, and also by choosing how to respond. So what people notice depends on who they are, depends on our sensory apparatus, of course, and in the case of humans, it also depends on the culture in which we live. Certain things we don't notice because, you know, we are not primed to notice these concepts or phenomena in a certain culture. So in the business world, this means, as important implication for management and leadership, it means that a message will get through to people, not necessarily because of its volume or frequency, but because it is meaningful to people. And this is a crucial difference between living organisms and machines. A machine can be controlled. A living organism can only be disturbed. And so the trick for managers and business leaders is to create meaningful disturbances, to give impulses rather than instructions. And that's a very new style of management.
I think this is absolutely spot on, because often with the work that my wife Maria and I do, introducing meaningful disturbances, you actually have to design a meaningful disturbance. It's not just about your more typical, oh, let's communicate the changes that we want. And you really have to do two things. You have to really work hard, especially at the level of the leadership of an organization, to really help them understand the need to enter into this understanding of meaningful. Because often...
Simon, let me give you an example, a very funny example. This was many years ago. There was an American computer company. I won't mention any names. They were on the east coast of the United States, and they had a branch in Sweden. And this branch in Sweden was tremendously successful in terms of increasing their productivity. So the people from the US sent a team to Sweden to find out what those guys were doing, why they were being so successful. And they found that the CEO of this branch in Sweden gave the staff complete freedom in designing their working environment. So people would bring in easy chairs, or couches or pillows, hammocks, you name it. They had a wild environment in which they felt comfortable. Well, what did the American team do? They took pictures of the furniture with the intention of using the same furniture back at home at headquarters. So they clearly mistook giving impulses, meaningful disturbances, for giving instructions.
I think that's a fabulous example, because there's this notion of empathy. And sometimes I still feel today there are certain business cultures, obviously not every business, but there are certain cultures where the leadership just don't have an empathy towards everyone working in the whole organization. This is a lot of our work that we do. How do you really engage people across whole organizations? And that's a wonderful example of taking a kind of mechanistic view and just missing the point of what makes that other company living. Daniel, it was really interesting earlier before, one of your key areas is design, and again, a successful approach to design is having an ability to understand meaning. It's not just about understanding the more technical solutions. How would you approach the concept of meaningful disturbances in your own work? This would be interesting to hear.
It's central to my own work, in the sense that for example, when I sat down to write my book, I asked myself the question, what can I actually write about that is going to have meaning in the long term? Because you can basically say that most of the solutions that we ever dreamt up as humanity at some point, sooner or later, turned into problems. And the people that dreamt up these solutions weren't necessarily bad people. So you can, like, very often, yesterday's solutions turn into today's problems. So how could my today's solutions not turn into tomorrow's problems? And so the epistemological shift that I tried to do with my book is very much focus on questions. And what is a question but a meaningful disturbance? Because a solution, no matter how brilliant it is and how well thought through it is, you're presenting it to the business leader as if you have to do this, do what I tell you, and then you'll be fine. Yeah? But the minute you ask questions, and it doesn't matter if they're leading questions, it's actually good if they're leading questions, then you're asking, it's a generative process. It's not a closing down, it's an opening up process. And let me give you a concrete example. Through a friend of mine from Biomimicry Iberia, I was put in touch with the long-range innovation manager of a Belgian detergent and cleaning products company. And I spoke with, they wanted to do a project on biomimicry. And so I had a 20-minute Skype call in which to make some suggestions. And I started off by saying, look, I don't think we need a gimmicky product design process of maybe making a bottle with less material because you base it on the structure of a diatom and therefore you use less plastic. You can do that, but it's a bit gimmicky to show that you're doing biomimicry. But let me ask you a question. What would your company have to do in order to produce like an ecosystem? In the region, for the region, with current solar income driving the production, no toxic accumulation, all these things that we can learn from nature when we look at how ecosystems recycle and create circular economies. And then I gave him a few more reasons of why that might be of interest, saying that if you have a company that ships chemicals from all over the world to a central location in Belgium, mixes them together and then ships them to hundreds of countries or whatever, lots of places around the world again, that is inherently expensive and has CO2 emissions associated with it. So this idea of decentralized manufacturing where even bigger global companies begin to regionalize production and consumption is very much in line with regenerative development. And by asking this question, I started a process that then led to a pilot project here on Mallorca, where we explored whether we can actually make cleaning products from Mallorcan waste streams, using organic municipal organic waste, using forestry waste, and then doing biofermentation processes in order to get the chemicals that you need in order to create cleaning products that can clean here on Mallorca.
It's really wonderful to hear, that we're actually able to create meaningful disturbances to such an extent. Fritjof, I've got one final question. One interesting challenge that many companies face are the fact that there's now many different generations in organizations. And maybe there's a challenge with the more senior people in an organization. How could they really introduce meaningful disturbances that are actually meaningful to the younger generations? I see this a lot in very large organizations. So do you have any advice for, say, people in the younger generation, people in their 20s, early 30s, if they wanted to introduce a meaningful disturbance, how would they go about it? Because the interesting thing I think about this concept is although it stems from really quite advanced theory, you can actually take the concept and you can introduce it into organizations without having to really have this kind of deep scientific understanding of where the theory comes from.
Well, I would say that you don't need to suggest to young people how to introduce meaningful disturbances. I mean, young people are disturbances to many of us older people. So what I would suggest to companies is to have a diversity of people of all ages. And I know that the company Amanaki in Brazil does that. Oscar Motomura has his design staff. When I did my course videos with them, we recorded 12 lectures there in São Paulo in Brazil. And I had a full team of the video and design people, and they were all under 30 or around 30. So Oscar has a lot of these young people who contribute with ideas, with skills, and of course, who are disturbances, because, the older senior members are often set in their ways. So just to mix the ages, I think, would be the best first step.
Definitely. I think, diversity it's such a hot topic. And I don't know, many companies still struggle to really truly value everybody in their organization. Sometimes the only people that are truly valued are those at the very top. But this is a massive loss for the organization in terms of really understanding how it needs to evolve to really move to becoming a regenerative and sustainable organization. Daniel.
Simon, there's one question that comes to mind that would be really, because you work a lot with high-level CEOs, and the question of what would it take for your company, so all your employers, from the lowest paid to the highest paid, would walk into the office in the morning with a feeling that they're not just working in the economy of money, but they're also working in the economy of meaning. That at the end of the day, when they come back home, they don't just get a little bit more of a paycheck at the end of the month. They feel like they've meaningfully contributed to something that is of importance to them, their family, their community, and to the community of life. If you ask that question in the right moment to the right guy, that's a meaningful disturbance.
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful example. There's an example of a company, again, in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. It's actually a beauty salon, Laces and Hair. And there, the founder, Chris Gios, when I first met her, it was really interesting. She didn't tell me how many employees were working for they call it the hair spa. She didn't talk about employees. She talked about how many families they have. And they really do quite amazing things to support not just their employees from a social perspective, but they actually very much support the families of the people working for them. And this is a very different approach to, this is a very authentic way of truly valuing everyone who works for your company, rather than, it's much more than just superficially trying to make people feel good. You know, that they support the families in many different ways, which is very wonderful. But unfortunately, I think it's still quite rare. But this is kind of hits the nail on the head. It's absolutely, how do we move to a more meaningful way of living?
And they are not the only ones. You know, this is a big trend now of having companies that have networks rather than departments, you know, teams that change with projects, you know, flat structures rather than hierarchies. They don't talk about employees anymore, and so on. So this is a big trend.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess another key word that we work with is the word flourishing. You know, how can an organization be flourishing, and how can it see itself not as a closed system with very clearly delineated boundaries, but how does a company truly see itself within the context of society and the context of, you know, our ecological systems? And again, I think as we move to different ways of self-organization, this kind of opens up people to really thinking more systemically, not just inside the organization, but much more wider as well.
Well, this is a big subject, and we could spend another hour now talking about this. But let me just say that in my book and in my course, I talk about this at length. And the basic point I make is that every human organization has a dual nature. It is a social institution designed for a particular purpose, and it is also a community of people. And how to combine those two is the art of management and leadership.
Daniel.
What came to mind as you both were speaking is to maybe highlight again the value of education, and Fritjof in a way did it by just mentioning the Capra course again. It's really, that can also be a meaningful disturbance, because we all through our education, through cultural osmosis, are looking into habitual ways of seeing. And as Fritjof said earlier with the Santiago theory of cognition, it's when we somehow get jolted that we have to structurally change, that we have to rearrange our mental maps of who we are. Like the big one being, which is also related to the Santiago theory of cognition, the split between nature and culture, that once we reintegrate humanity into nature as nature, we completely change how we act. And so for me, education, like I work with Gaia Education quite a lot in a lot of countries, and I see how in relatively short programs you can create transformative processes that really make people shift the way that they see their role in their organization or see their future when you're working with young people. And so I'm just really thrilled that I had the pleasure of joining last year's Capra course, and it's a wonderful set of videos, and it's a great community to engage with, and I would like to do it again.
So yeah, we're just coming up to the end of this webinar. It's actually really nice that we're just talking about education. There's been a lot of people joining us for this webinar today, and I'm very grateful for everyone's comments who were able to join us today. There will be people watching the recording, of course, afterwards. Fritjof, it's been quite a great experience for me taking part in Capra course. And of course, you are still so in demand as a great teacher. It's been really interesting the way that you've created Capra course, because it's been quite, in just the space of a webinar, 1 hour webinar, it's almost impossible to really take lots of people's questions and give people's questions the time and respect that each one really deserves. And I think I'd just like to finish by asking you a little bit about your experience with Capra course, because it's quite incredible. We've had some very amazing comments from people that have done it, really in terms of the amount of access they have to you, the depth of discussion and the way in which they can ask questions. Daniel, you were emphasizing the way we always need to ask questions. Because Fritjof, you really dedicate a lot of time to the course. You don't book many meetings or travels when Capra course is taking place. So could you just finish by talking just a little bit, how has the experience been on Capra course?
It has been extremely rewarding. I have given taught courses, seminars, classes for decades, and I find that this online course is very different from an experience in a classroom. I mean, I'm talking about the discussion. In a classroom, somebody asks a question, and many times people say, well, I'm not quite sure how to ask this question, but you know, this is what I'd like to know. And then I say, well, I can give you sort of an answer, but you have to say something right away. Whereas in Capra course, somebody posts a question, and usually what I do in the morning at some time, I look at the comments and questions in the discussion forum, and then I switch it off. And then I go and shave and, you know, do my daily routine, have breakfast, and I think about what to say. And so over the day, I get some ideas. Now, I might go to my library, look up some books. I might go to the internet and look up some websites, and then I give a really substantial answer with references and everything. Also, by the time when somebody in Australia, say, posts a question, by the time I get to see, somebody else in Europe might have seen it already and might have answered already. It's a constant global dialogue. So I find it extremely rewarding. And I spend a lot of time on it, but for me, it's not very much. It's about, on the average, half an hour a day. But it gives me the opportunity of really engaging with everybody who wants to. Let me also say that we usually have between 150 and 200 participants, and not all of them engage in discussion. Only about maybe a third of them. But those who do engage, you know, in a very passionate and very substantial way.
And I think that really just shows, you know, the value for those people who really take the time, because they actually have 16 weeks of discussion with you, of daily discussion with you. And that's just absolutely remarkable, especially in terms of meaningful disturbances. So yeah, finally, I think we just close it. I'll close now, but it's been, as I say, it's been really wonderful to take part in Capra course. And also for some of the people listening, registration is now open for the fall 2017 edition. So in terms of how can people really carry on this rich conversation that we've started today, Capra course starts on the 6th of September. So please do, you know, take a look at Capra course to see, for those of you who may be interested in taking part.